Important battles. Really quick, I wanted to talk about this though. I don't go into the specifics of a lot of the battles in the Civil War, partly because that would take a whole lot of time, and this class is covering a whole lot of history, not just military history. So when I'm going into the details of some of these, really look for themes that occur multiple times. I believe the only two battles that I would maybe make specific notes on would be Antietam, more because it has to do with something else, as well as Gettysburg. Late in 1862, General McClellan is going to be replaced by General Ambrose E. Burnside. Now, Burnside, first of all, you should definitely go look up a picture of him because basically he is why we call him Sideburns today. But he was a very shy and insecure man. Twice he had actually refused command, claiming that he was incompetent. And quite frankly, he was correct. At Fredericksburg in November of 1862, Union forces are going to launch a poorly coordinated and quite frankly a foolish frontal assault that the Confederates are basically going to repel and in the process also inflict really heavy casualties on the Union side. At this time, Burnside would be relieved of command and he would be replaced with Major General Joseph Hooker. Now, Hooker did not have the humility that Burnside did, but he also didn't have the incompetence. So he is going to resume the offensive in the spring of 1863, and his hope was actually to outflank Lee. But Lee actually surprised Hooker by sending Stonewall Jackson to outflank the Union forces. Lee's army is going to deliver a series of crushing attacks against Hooker's forces at Chancellorsville, and what we see here is Lee really pulls off a stunning victory for the so-called Confederacy, but it's also at a very high cost. Really quick technical term, when I use the term lost, this is going to include all who are killed, wounded, and missing after a battle. So the thing is, Lee in this engagement with Hooker, Lee loses 13,000 men, but technically he won because Hooker lost 17,000 men. But the problem is you have to look at those numbers of the South. This was more than the so-called Confederacy could really afford to lose in one engagement, but it still seems like Lee is invincible. At this point, Lee planned to take advantage of the so-called Confederacy's momentum, as well as the Union's gloom, and he heads north. While Union forces were supposed to go after Lee, General Hooker actually dallied, requested more troops, and basically this allows the Confederates to march from Maryland all the way up into Pennsylvania. At that point, when Lee heard of Meade's movement, because basically Hooker's going to be replaced with George Gordon Meade. So when Lee hears about Meade's movements, he's going to order his troops into a defensive position. And this is when we get the so-called greatest battle of the Civil War erupting at nearby Gettysburg. So this is the only battle I break into parts, so you can kind of see what's happening here. On the first day in Gettysburg, the so-called Confederacy, they appeared to gain the upper hand. They're going to force Union forces all the way back from the town of Gettysburg into a position at Cemetery Hill. On the second day, Union forces are finally all in place, and for a time, the so-called Confederacy is doing well, taking several key locations, but then by the end of the day, they're going to basically be pushed back to the previous day's positions. The third day, Lee makes a fateful error. He believed the very center of Meade's line to be weak and basically orders this all-out assault against it. And in the middle of the afternoon, the Union guns go silent. So Lee and the Confederates basically thought that they had knocked out Meade's center line. And so they begin a charge led by one General George Pickett. These Confederates charge out, battle colors flying, and the Union artillery opens up fire again and basically tears them apart. The thing is, after this happens, after Pickett's failed charge, Lee rides amongst his troops, warning them to brace because there'll be one more final assault by the Union forces. But the assault never comes. So basically, the Union fails to push forward after defeating Pickett in his charge. This basically allows Lee to end up withdrawing back into Maryland, crossing the Potomac all the way back into Virginia. Gettysburg is considered the bloodiest battle of the war. The Union is going to have 23,000 casualties about. When I say casualties, that's another technical term. That means like killed, wounded, or missing. And the so-called Confederacy has somewhere between 23,000 to 28,000 casualties. So this is a huge win for the North, and it boosts morale for them and really lifts a lot of the veil of gloom in the North. Many historians write this really as the real turning point of the Civil War, and that at this point now it becomes more and more certain that the North is going to win. The thing about Gettysburg is considered, if you're just looking at Union soldiers' deaths, it is the fourth deadliest battle in all of American history. Which brings us to other battles in the Western theater of the war. So remember that Western theater, like you can see that more here on the map with like Chattanooga and Vicksburg and everything like that. The Union is going to be very much successful in this Western region, and this is actually going to compromise the South's ability to transport goods as well as men across rail lines and waterways, and this ends up leaving Georgia vulnerable eventually. Vicksburg is going to present Grant with some strategic obstacles. Basically, it overlooked and controlled the Mississippi River, and up until this point, it had thwarted any Union naval assault against it. Some of this is because there's like a labyrinth of swamps around it and creeks and woods protecting it from the north. And so in March of 1863, Grant is basically going to devise a plan to take Vicksburg, where he would ferry across the Mississippi River into Mississippi from Louisiana. But then rather than going after Vicksburg, he actually marched to the center of the state of Mississippi. He moved northeastward, captured the Mississippi state capital of Jackson, and then turned back to the west towards Vicksburg and settled down in front of the city less than like 600 yards away from the Confederate positions. Basically, at this point, they would have a tight siege of the city, as well as the Union's navy would bombard them, so it's basically cutting them off from multiple sides. And General John Pemberton of the so-called Confederacy will surrender Vicksburg on July 4th of 1863, which is right literally with Gettysburg, because Gettysburg was July 1st through 3rd. So these things are almost happening simultaneously, basically. During this, though, we also have Union General William S. Rosecrans advancing against Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Braxton Bragg. I know I say general here, but he actually only got to lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. He was only considered a general in the Confederate Army, and as the Confederate is not a legitimate nation, that's why I'm going to refer to him as lieutenant colonel. Anyway, Bragg held Chattanooga, and the thing is, Chattanooga was really important because it had a railroad that really linked Richmond, the capital of the so-called Confederacy, to the rest of the lower South. So to capture that city would mean basically uncoupling the entirety of the western southern region from the eastern portion of the so-called Confederacy. These two armies are going to end up clashing actually at Chickamauga in September of 1863. Both sides are going to suffer heavy casualties. It seems like for a moment that the Union's strategy for conquest in the western portion of the Confederacy seems in jeopardy. But then it turns out the Confederate Army was actually really divided, and there was just some dissension where officers were actually openly questioning Bragg's ability to lead them, whereas we're going to see the Union generals, Grant, Sherman, and Hooker, take advantage of this divided Confederate army and basically break up the siege and force Bragg's army into retreat all the way into Georgia. So basically at this point, the Union is dominating most of the West and facing an open road to the east. But there's one thing that's wrong about this map, and there's one other thing here. If you look further west, looking at Texas. So Texas should be considered one of the Confederate states. I hate that this map doesn't seem to have it gray for some reason. But the thing is, Texas was really critical initially for the so-called Confederacy because basically it was a source of supplies for the eastern portions of the so-called Confederacy, as well as it basically was a base that would be very hard to conquer because it's so far to the west. But Texas was really far from secure. In fact, it suffered from a lot of internal dissent and violence along its borders. Eventually, we're going to see that Union gunboats and troops would disrupt this supply line to Texas and from Texas. And by 1864, the Union controls the Mississippi River, as well as they have federal troops stationed along the Mexican border. And at that point, basically, any strategic importance of Texas is lost.